The quickest way to lose a courtroom is to underestimate the quietest person inside it. The old wooden courtroom carried the scent of polished oak, aging paper, and fresh coffee from the clerk's desk as conversations echoed softly beneath the fluorescent lights. Attorneys shuffled thick binders. Reporters adjusted their notebooks. Curious spectators leaned forward, already convinced they knew how the morning would end. At the defense table sat Ethan Walker, a 38-year-old white American single father and Army veteran wearing a neatly pressed but inexpensive Navy suit that had clearly seen better days. Beside his chair rested a worn leather briefcase, its corners softened by years of use rather than luxury. He did not fidget. He did not look angry. He simply rested one steady hand on the folder before him while quietly watching the room settle into place. Across from him stood one of the state's most recognizable trial attorneys, Richard Coleman, a man whose expensive watch reflected the courtroom lights each time he turned a page. Confidence surrounded him like a tailored overcoat. He smiled politely toward the jury, nodded respectfully toward the bench, then glanced at Ethan with the kind of brief look reserved for opponents already considered defeated. The courtroom doors opened once more as Judge Victoria Hayes entered with measured steps, her black robe flowing gently behind her. Every voice disappeared. Every chair straightened. The bailiff announced the court, and the room rose together before settling back into silence. Judge Hayes reviewed the file for only a few moments before lifting her eyes toward Ethan. There was no hostility in her expression, only professional impatience sharpened by a crowded docket and years of experience. "Mr. Walker," she said evenly, "I understand you have chosen to represent yourself." Ethan stood calmly. "Yes, Your Honor." She folded her hands. "You were advised to retain counsel." "Yes, Your Honor." "You declined?" "Yes, Your Honor." A faint murmur traveled through the gallery. Judge Hayes exhaled quietly before speaking again. "This court strongly discourages self-representation in matters this complex." Ethan nodded once. "I understand." Richard Coleman allowed himself a small smile. One reporter quietly scribbled a note before the first witness had even been called. Judge Hayes continued, "Without an attorney, you are placing yourself at a serious disadvantage." Ethan remained respectful. "I understand." She looked down briefly at the case file before returning her attention to him. "Quite frankly, Mr. Walker, you are wasting valuable court time if you believe this case can be properly argued without legal training." A few restrained chuckles escaped from the back row before immediately fading beneath the judge's presence. Ethan did not react. He neither defended himself nor challenged her observation. Instead, he waited until complete silence returned. Then he spoke with the same calm voice he had used from the beginning. "May I ask one question before this court dismisses me?" The courtroom seemed to pause. Judge Hayes studied him for a long second. "Proceed." Ethan did not turn toward the jury. He did not look toward the opposing attorney. His eyes remained respectfully on the bench. "If the truth depends upon who paid the larger legal bill," he asked quietly, "why does every witness still swear to tell only the truth?" No one answered. Even Richard Coleman's confident smile faded just slightly before returning. Judge Hayes looked at Ethan with a different expression, not agreement, not respect yet, but curiosity. It lasted only a heartbeat before she resumed the formal rhythm of the proceeding. "Opening statements will begin shortly," she announced. "Let us remain focused on the evidence." Ethan nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." He sat back down, gently opening the worn leather briefcase. Inside were neatly organized legal pads, carefully labeled documents, handwritten timelines, military notebooks filled with precise observations, and several photographs secured in protective sleeves. Everything had been arranged with remarkable discipline. There were no expensive legal assistants preparing exhibits, no paralegals whispering strategy, no team of associates rushing paperwork to counsel table. Only one father quietly reviewing every page himself. In the second row, behind him sat 8-year-old Emma Walker beside Ethan's elderly neighbor, Margaret Collins, who had volunteered to watch over the little girl during the hearing. Emma wore a simple blue dress and held a small notebook in her lap. She watched her father with complete confidence, occasionally offering a reassuring smile whenever he glanced back toward her. He answered each smile with one of his own before returning his attention to the courtroom. The quiet exchange lasted only seconds, yet it carried more strength than any speech could have offered. Richard Coleman rose confidently for his opening statement, his polished voice filling the room as he outlined a narrative that seemed carefully constructed to leave no space for doubt. Every sentence sounded practiced. Every pause sounded intentional. He promised the jury overwhelming evidence and a witness whose testimony, according to him, would settle every disputed fact beyond question. Several jurors nodded almost instinctively while taking notes. Judge Hayes listened attentively, occasionally writing short observations in the margin of her file. When Coleman finished, he returned to counsel table wearing the expression of a man who expected the remainder of the trial to unfold exactly as planned. Judge Hayes turned toward Ethan. "Mr. Walker, your opening statement." Ethan stood once again. He carried no stack of prepared pages. He approached no podium. He simply faced the jury with quiet dignity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began softly, "I cannot promise louder arguments than the attorney across the room. I cannot promise polished speeches. But I can promise one thing. Before this trial ends, every answer will matter more than every accusation." His words were simple. His tone never changed. Yet somewhere inside the old courtroom, beneath the humming fluorescent lights and the ticking wall clock, something almost impossible to notice had quietly begun to shift. The courthouse emptied into the cool afternoon air, but Ethan Walker did not leave immediately. He remained seated at the defense table until nearly everyone else had disappeared into the hallway, carefully returning each document to the exact place. Inside his worn leather briefcase, years in the Army had taught him that discipline began with the smallest habits. A straight stack of papers, a clean notebook, a quiet mind before the next challenge. Judge Victoria Hayes had already moved on to another case, and Richard Coleman was surrounded by associates discussing strategy with easy confidence. None of them looked back at the man working alone. Ethan closed the briefcase, stood, and turned toward the second row where 8-year-old Emma waited with Margaret Collins. Emma smiled the moment their eyes met. "You did great, Dad," she whispered as she wrapped her small arms around him. Ethan smiled warmly before brushing a loose strand of blonde hair away from her face. "We are only getting started." Margaret picked up Emma's backpack. "Would you like me to make dinner tonight?" Ethan shook his head appreciatively. "Thank you, Margaret, but Emma promised to help me with spaghetti." Emma grinned proudly. "I am in charge of the garlic bread." Margaret laughed softly. "Then your father is in very good hands." The drive home took almost 30 minutes through quiet neighborhoods lined with maple trees beginning to lose their autumn leaves. Ethan drove an aging silver pickup truck that carried more memories than value. Emma watched the passing streets before quietly asking the question she had been holding all afternoon. "Were you nervous?" Ethan thought for a moment before answering honestly. "A little." "You did not look nervous." "Sometimes courage looks very quiet." Emma nodded thoughtfully and looked back out the window. She had heard her father say similar things ever since she was old enough to understand difficult days. Their small rented house stood on a peaceful street where neighbors still waved from front porches and children rode bicycles before sunset. The white paint had begun to fade, and the porch steps creaked with every footstep, but flower boxes beneath the windows remained carefully cared for because Ethan believed that taking pride in simple things mattered. Inside, framed family photographs filled the living room. One picture showed Ethan wearing his Army uniform while holding a much younger Emma beside his late wife, Sarah, whose warm smile still seemed to brighten the room years after her passing. Another photograph captured Emma's first day of kindergarten, proudly holding her tiny backpack while Ethan knelt beside her. Nothing inside the home was expensive, yet everything reflected care rather than hardship. Emma immediately washed her hands before climbing onto a kitchen stool. Ethan filled a pot with water while she carefully arranged slices of garlic bread on a baking tray exactly as he had taught her. The familiar rhythm of cooking together eased the weight carried home from the courthouse. "Do you think the judge likes you?" Emma suddenly asked. Ethan smiled without looking up from the stove. A judge is not supposed to like or dislike anyone. But she seemed upset. Ethan stirred the sauce slowly. "She has a difficult job. She only knows what she has seen so far." Emma considered that answer. "Then maybe she will know you better later." Ethan looked at his daughter with quiet pride. That is exactly how truth usually works. After dinner, Emma spread her homework across the dining table, while Ethan sat nearby reviewing legal documents beneath the soft glow of a reading lamp. Every page contained handwritten notes, carefully organized timelines, witness statements, photographs, and legal citations copied by hand after countless evenings spent at the public law library. He had chosen not to hire an attorney because every dollar he earned already had a purpose: rent, groceries, school supplies, medical insurance, savings for Emma's future. There had never been enough left to pay legal fees that exceeded an entire year's income. Yet he refused to complain. Instead, he prepared one page at a time. Emma looked up from her math assignment. "Dad, yes. Why did you never tell anyone you studied law in the army?" Ethan quietly closed one notebook before answering. "Because today was not the right day." "Will tomorrow be?" He smiled gently. "Only if the truth needs it." Emma accepted that answer without another question. She had learned long ago that her father never hid the truth, but he also never rushed to prove himself. Later that evening, after Emma had fallen asleep, Ethan stood alone on the back porch holding a warm cup of coffee as cool October air carried the scent of fallen leaves across the neighborhood. The courthouse replayed quietly in his mind. Judge Hayes's words, Richard Coleman's confidence, the laughter from the gallery. None of it made him angry. Instead, it reminded him of something an old military instructor had once said during officer training: "Never mistake confidence for accuracy." Ethan looked toward the night sky, where a few stars appeared between slow-moving clouds. Tomorrow the opposing side would call its most important witness, a testimony everyone expected to end the case. Ethan knew exactly who that witness was. He also knew something no one else inside that courtroom had yet realized. The strongest testimony in the room was built upon a detail so small that almost everyone had overlooked it. Almost everyone. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall courtroom windows, casting long bands of pale gold across the polished wooden floor as the second day of testimony quietly began. The familiar scent of old paper, polished oak, and freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air while attorneys arranged exhibits with practiced precision. Spectators gradually filled every available seat, whispering to one another about the case that had unexpectedly drawn attention throughout the county. Most of them had returned for one reason. They wanted to watch the experienced trial attorney dismantle the single father representing himself. Ethan Walker entered carrying the same worn leather briefcase he had carried the previous day. His navy suit remained carefully pressed, his shoes polished, and every document inside his briefcase rested exactly where he had placed it the night before. He greeted the court clerk with a respectful nod before quietly taking his seat. Across the aisle, Richard Coleman stood beside two associates reviewing thick binders filled with color-coded tabs. Their confidence appeared effortless. One associate smiled as she noticed Ethan sitting alone. "He still came without counsel," she whispered. Coleman barely looked up. "That makes today's schedule much simpler." Neither man realized Ethan had heard every word. He simply opened his notebook and continued reviewing handwritten notes with the same calm concentration he would have given a maintenance checklist years earlier during his military service. In the second row, Emma Walker settled beside Margaret Collins, holding the same small notebook she had brought the previous day. She smiled toward her father. Ethan answered with a quiet nod before turning back toward the bench. Judge Victoria Hayes entered promptly at 9 o'clock. The bailiff announced the court, and everyone rose before taking their seats once again. The judge reviewed several procedural matters before looking toward Richard Coleman. "You may call your next witness." Coleman stood confidently. "The plaintiff calls Dr. Michael Bennett." A distinguished man in his late 50s walked steadily toward the witness stand wearing a tailored gray suit and carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to speaking before juries. His credentials alone filled nearly 2 pages of the court record. Former forensic consultant, university lecturer, published author, expert witness in dozens of civil proceedings. Several jurors immediately began highlighting portions of his resume. Coleman approached the witness with a relaxed smile. "Dr. Bennett, could you briefly explain your professional background for the jury?" The doctor answered smoothly, describing decades of experience evaluating evidence, reconstructing timelines, and analyzing witness reliability. Every answer sounded measured, confident, and polished. Coleman slowly guided the testimony toward the central issue of the case, allowing Dr. Bennett to explain why, in his professional opinion, the available evidence strongly supported the plaintiff's version of events. Charts appeared on digital monitors. Enlarged photographs were displayed. Timelines stretched across presentation boards. Piece after piece seemed to fit together perfectly. The jurors watched attentively while several spectators quietly nodded. Judge Hayes listened with careful focus, occasionally making notes in the margin of her legal pad. Ethan remained almost completely still. He wrote only a few brief lines inside his notebook before looking up again. Coleman concluded the direct examination with visible satisfaction. Dr. Bennett, based upon your experience and your review of every available record, do you have any reasonable doubt regarding your conclusions? No, the witness answered confidently. I do not. Coleman smiled before returning to counsel table. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Hayes looked toward Ethan. Mr. Walker, you may cross-examine the witness. The courtroom became unusually quiet. Even those who expected little from Ethan leaned forward with curiosity. Richard Coleman folded his hands comfortably, clearly expecting only a few uncertain questions before the examination ended. Ethan rose slowly, buttoned his jacket, and carried nothing except a yellow legal pad and one sharpened pencil. He did not approach the witness with dramatic gestures. He simply stopped a respectful distance away and looked directly at Dr. Bennett. Good morning, Doctor. Good morning. Ethan smiled politely. Thank you for being here. The witness nodded. Of course. Ethan glanced briefly at his notes before asking his first question. How many hours did you personally spend reviewing the complete file in this case? Dr. Bennett answered immediately. Approximately 18 hours. Ethan nodded once and wrote down the number. Did you personally visit the location discussed in your report? No. Did you personally interview every witness? No. Did you rely upon photographs supplied by the plaintiff? Yes. Did you rely upon measurements provided by someone else? Yes. Each answer remained calm, uncomplicated, and perfectly reasonable. Yet something subtle began changing inside the courtroom. Ethan never challenged the witness. He never argued. He simply continued asking short questions in an almost conversational tone. The rhythm felt strangely familiar, almost methodical, like someone patiently assembling pieces of a puzzle instead of trying to win an argument. Judge Victoria Hayes quietly stopped writing and looked up from her notes for the first time since the examination had begun. Richard Coleman shifted slightly in his chair. The jurors continued writing. Somewhere beneath the quiet cadence of Ethan's questions, almost too quietly for anyone to recognize, the first invisible crack had begun to appear in what everyone had believed was the strongest testimony of the entire case. Dr. Michael Bennett remained composed as Ethan Walker continued standing only a few feet from the witness stand with nothing more than a yellow legal pad resting in one hand. The courtroom had grown noticeably quieter. Even the reporters who had spent the morning writing almost continuously now looked up more often than they looked down. Ethan never raised his voice. He never attempted to impress the jury with complicated legal language. Instead, he allowed each question to arrive slowly, giving every answer room to breathe before moving to the next. Dr. Bennett, he asked politely, you testified that your conclusions relied upon the photographs submitted into evidence. That is correct. You also testified that you never personally visited the location. Correct. Ethan nodded once. Would you agree that photographs sometimes fail to capture depth accurately? In certain situations, yes. Would you agree that camera angles can affect the apparent distance between two objects? Yes. Ethan wrote another short note. Richard Coleman leaned back in his chair with an expression that still suggested confidence, but he had stopped smiling. Judge Victoria Hayes watched the witness more closely now than she had during the direct examination. Ethan continued with the same calm rhythm. Doctor, were you informed which camera lens was used to produce Exhibit 12? Dr. Bennett hesitated for the first time. I do not recall reviewing that information. So the answer is no? To the best of my knowledge, no. Ethan thanked him with a respectful nod. Were you informed whether the image had been digitally cropped before being included in your report? Another pause followed. I do not believe I was. Ethan looked briefly toward the jury before returning his attention to the witness. If a photograph were cropped, could it remove visual references? That help estimate distance? Dr. Bennett answered honestly. Yes, it could. A faint rustle moved through the jury box as several jurors underlined notes they had already written. Ethan did not react. His expression remained thoughtful rather than triumphant. He slowly picked up a laminated copy of Exhibit 12 from the evidence table. Doctor, this is the same photograph you relied upon. Yes. Ethan held the photograph carefully without dramatics. Could you point to the location where you determined the observation distance? Dr. Bennett leaned slightly forward. Approximately there. Ethan nodded. Approximately. Yes. Not exactly. Exact measurements were provided separately. Ethan smiled politely. Provided by whom? The investigative report. Prepared by someone other than you? Yes. Richard Coleman rose immediately. Objection, Your Honor. The witness has already explained the basis of his opinion. Judge Hayes considered the objection only briefly. Overruled. The witness may answer. Coleman sat down again, but the confidence he had displayed earlier had become noticeably restrained. Ethan returned to the witness with the same measured pace. Doctor, if the measurements supplied to you contained even a small error, would your calculations also reflect that error? Dr. Bennett answered carefully. Potentially, yes. Thank you. Ethan placed the photograph back onto the evidence table with remarkable care. There was no dramatic flourish, no theatrical pause. Only quiet precision. Emma watched from the second row with complete attention, her small notebook resting forgotten in her lap. Margaret Collins glanced between Ethan and the jury, sensing the atmosphere changing in ways difficult to explain. Judge Hayes rested her pen beside her notebook instead of writing. She had begun listening differently. Ethan asked another question. Doctor, you testified yesterday that visibility conditions supported the plaintiff's timeline. Yes. Did you personally verify the weather records for that specific hour? No. Who provided those records? The investigative summary. Prepared by. Dr. Bennett looked toward Richard Coleman before answering. The plaintiff's investigative consultant. Ethan waited one respectful second before asking quietly. So your conclusion depends upon information gathered entirely by others? Dr. Bennett answered with visible honesty. My professional opinion relied upon the materials supplied to me. Ethan smiled. Thank you. That is all I wanted to clarify. Silence settled across the courtroom. There had been no accusation, no confrontation, no attempt to embarrass the witness. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The expert still possessed impressive credentials. His reputation remained intact, but the certainty surrounding his testimony had become noticeably less absolute. Judge Hayes folded her hands together while studying Ethan with new curiosity. Richard Coleman quietly opened one of his binders, searching for something he suddenly seemed uncertain he would find. Ethan glanced once toward Emma. She smiled with quiet pride before giving the smallest encouraging nod. He answered with an equally small smile before turning back toward the witness stand. The strongest testimony presented so far had not collapsed, but its flawless appearance now carried visible fractures, and for the very first time since the trial had begun, the courtroom no longer viewed the single father standing alone as a man simply trying to defend himself. They had begun watching him as someone who knew exactly where he was leading every question. Dr. Michael Bennett remained seated in the witness chair, but the certainty that had surrounded him only minutes earlier no longer filled the courtroom quite as completely. Ethan Walker quietly returned to the evidence table, opened his worn leather briefcase, and removed a carefully organized binder with colored tabs marking specific pages. Every movement reflected patience rather than urgency. Judge Victoria Hayes noticed the precision immediately. Nothing Ethan touched appeared accidental. Nothing seemed improvised. Richard Coleman watched closely, his fingers resting on the edge of his legal pad without writing a single word. The jurors leaned forward almost together, sensing that the calm rhythm of the questioning was leading somewhere far more significant than anyone had expected when the morning began. Ethan approached the witness once again with the same respectful expression. Dr. Bennett, may I ask you a few questions about time? Certainly. You stated yesterday that the timeline presented in your report was accurate within approximately 2 minutes. Yes. That opinion was based upon the investigative report you received? Correct. Ethan nodded. Did you personally verify the timestamp printed on Exhibit 15? Dr. Bennett looked briefly toward the display monitor before answering. I accepted it as accurate. Did you verify whether the recording device synchronized automatically with official time? No. Did anyone tell you whether the clock inside that device had been calibrated? The witness paused. No. Ethan thanked him quietly before lifting a printed photograph from the binder. It showed the same location discussed throughout the trial, captured from a slightly different angle. "Doctor, have you seen this photograph before today?" "No. It was produced during discovery, but not included in your review package." Richard Coleman immediately stood. "Objection, Your Honor." "Foundation." Ethan answered calmly before the judge spoke. "Your Honor, the photograph has already been admitted as part of the discovery record. I am only asking whether the witness previously reviewed it." Judge Hayes glanced toward the clerk, who quickly confirmed the exhibit number. She looked back toward the courtroom. "Overruled. The witness may answer." Dr. Bennett examined the photograph more carefully. "No, I was not provided this image." Ethan placed the photograph beside the enlarged exhibit already displayed on the monitor. "Would you agree these two photographs depict the same location?" "Yes." "Taken from different positions?" "Yes." "Does this second angle reveal additional landmarks not visible in the first?" Dr. Bennett studied both images silently before answering. "Yes, it does." Ethan waited one respectful moment. "Would those additional landmarks assist someone attempting to estimate distance more accurately?" "Potentially, yes." Several jurors exchanged quick glances before returning to their notes. Richard Coleman quietly reached for another binder, turning pages more quickly than before. Ethan continued without changing his tone. "Doctor, when you prepared your report, you concluded the witness could clearly observe every relevant event from the reported position." "Yes." "That conclusion depended upon line of sight." "Correct." Ethan picked up a transparent overlay from his binder and gently placed it over the enlarged photograph. Thin reference lines appeared across the image. These measurements were prepared using the county survey completed 3 years before this incident. "Do you recognize the survey?" Dr. Bennett adjusted his glasses. "Yes, I recognize the county markings." "Would you agree the large oak tree shown here existed on the survey date?" "Yes." "Would you also agree that tree does not appear anywhere in Exhibit 12? Another pause settled over the courtroom. Dr. Bennett looked carefully at both displays before answering. "That appears to be correct." Ethan nodded. "If that tree stood between the witness and the reported observation point, would it affect visibility?" Richard Coleman rose quickly. "Objection. Calls for speculation." Judge Hayes looked toward Dr. Bennett. "Can the witness answer based upon his expertise?" Dr. Bennett responded before either attorney could continue. "If the tree occupied the documented location and remained standing on the date in question, visibility could indeed be affected." Judge Hayes turned back toward Coleman. "Objection overruled." Coleman slowly sat down, his expression no longer carrying the quiet confidence displayed at the beginning of the morning. Ethan thanked the witness once again. "Doctor, I appreciate your honesty. I answer the questions placed before me." Ethan smiled respectfully. "I believe that is exactly what every witness should do." A silence followed, unlike any earlier moment in the trial. It was not uncomfortable. It was thoughtful. Judge Hayes rested both hands on the bench while carefully studying the survey map, the photographs, and the witness. The certainty that had once surrounded the plaintiff's strongest evidence continued to weaken, not because anyone had attacked Dr. Bennett's integrity, but because careful questions had exposed how many important assumptions rested beneath conclusions everyone had accepted without hesitation. In the second row, Emma watched her father with quiet admiration. She remembered the evenings spent at the dining room table while he measured diagrams with an old ruler, copied notes by hand, and checked every date 3 different times before placing another page inside the binder. At the time, she thought he was simply being careful. Sitting inside the courtroom now, she finally understood. He had never been preparing to defeat another person. He had been preparing to let the truth speak one small detail at a time, and for the first time since the trial began, the entire courtroom seemed willing to listen. Dr. Michael Bennett remained on the witness stand, but the confidence that had filled his voice during the morning now carried a thoughtful caution. Ethan Walker did not celebrate the change. He simply thanked the witness for each honest answer before returning to the defense table. The quiet scrape of his chair across the polished courtroom floor echoed more loudly than anyone expected because almost nobody else was moving. Richard Coleman reviewed his notes with increasing urgency, flipping through page after page while searching for a response that refused to appear. Judge Victoria Hayes observed every expression in the room before calmly addressing Ethan. Mr. Walker, you may continue. Ethan stood once more, carrying only a single legal pad. Thank you, Your Honor. He approached the witness with the same measured pace that had defined every moment of his cross-examination. There was no trace of triumph in his face, only patience. Dr. Bennett, he began softly, I would like to discuss one final area. Very well. Your report states that the primary eyewitness identified the events from approximately 180 feet away. Yes. That estimate relied upon the measurements supplied to you? Correct. Ethan nodded. Would you agree that human perception changes as distance increases? Certainly. Would lighting conditions also influence perception? Yes. Would weather conditions matter? Yes. Ethan paused briefly before asking another question. Would the color of clothing become more difficult to distinguish as distance and visual obstruction increase? Dr. Bennett answered carefully. Generally speaking, yes. Ethan thanked him before opening another folder inside his briefcase. He removed a weather report certified by the National Weather Service together with a county maintenance record already admitted into evidence. He handed both documents to the bailiff, who delivered them to the witness and the bench. Judge Hayes examined the documents silently while Dr. Bennett reviewed the first page. Ethan waited respectfully until both had finished reading. Doctor, according to the certified weather report, cloud cover reached nearly 90% during the hour in question. Is that correct? Yes. The report also records intermittent rainfall? Yes. Ethan continued. The county maintenance report confirms that one streetlight near the reported observation point had been out of service for several days before the incident. Dr. Bennett slowly nodded. That is what the document states. Ethan looked toward the jury before returning to the witness. Were either of these documents included in the materials provided to you before you prepared your expert opinion? No. Another quiet murmur passed through the gallery before disappearing just as quickly. Richard Coleman rose immediately. Objection, Your Honor. The witness has already explained that he relied upon the investigative file. Judge Hayes looked calmly toward Ethan. Response. Ethan answered with complete respect. Your Honor, I am simply determining whether the expert had access to all relevant environmental conditions before reaching his conclusions. Judge Hayes considered the question for only a moment. Overruled. Coleman slowly sat back down, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. Ethan continued in exactly the same calm tone. Dr. Bennett, if reduced lighting, rain, visual obstruction, and uncertain distance measurements all existed simultaneously, would your confidence level remain? Exactly the same. The witness remained silent for several seconds. Every person inside the courtroom waited. Finally, Dr. Bennett answered with complete honesty. No. Under those combined circumstances, my confidence would necessarily decrease. Ethan inclined his head respectfully. Would you describe that decrease as minor or significant? Dr. Bennett looked down at the reports once more before lifting his eyes toward the jury. Significant. No one moved. The words seemed to linger beneath the high courtroom ceiling long after it had been spoken. Judge Hayes slowly placed her pen on the bench instead of writing another note. Richard Coleman looked toward the witness with visible concern for the first time since the trial had begun. Several jurors quietly circled the same word inside their notebooks. Ethan did not press further. He simply allowed the answer to settle naturally. After a respectful pause, he asked one final question. Doctor, is it fair to say that your professional integrity requires you to revise your opinion whenever important information becomes available? Dr. Bennett answered without hesitation. Yes, that is both my ethical and professional responsibility. Ethan smiled warmly. Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate your honesty. He returned to his table without another word. The silence inside the courtroom felt different now. It was no longer the silence of spectators waiting to watch a self-represented father struggle against experienced attorneys. It had become the silence of people carefully reconsidering assumptions they had accepted only hours earlier. Judge Victoria Hayes looked from the witness to Ethan, then toward the jury. Something in her expression had changed as well. The impatience visible during the opening session had quietly disappeared, replaced by careful attention and growing respect. Richard Coleman requested a brief recess before redirect examination. Judge Hayes granted the request with a measured nod. As the bailiff announced the short break, Conversations did not immediately resume. Most people remained seated, quietly reflecting on what they had just witnessed. Emma looked toward her father from the second row. Ethan smiled gently, offering nothing more than a reassuring nod. She smiled back, understanding that the most important victory so far had not been winning an argument. It had been proving that careful questions, honest answers, and quiet dignity possessed a strength louder than confidence ever could. The 15-minute recess passed quietly, yet the atmosphere inside the courthouse no longer resembled the one that had existed at the beginning of the morning. Conversations remained softer. Reporters compared notes with expressions of genuine surprise instead of quiet certainty. Even members of the jury returned to their seats carrying themselves with greater concentration, as though they had begun watching an entirely different trial. Ethan Walker remained alone at the defense table, carefully reviewing only 3 pages from his binder before closing it again. He did not rush through stacks of documents or rehearse dramatic speeches. He simply reread a single handwritten note, folded it neatly into the front pocket of his legal pad, and waited. Across the aisle, Richard Coleman spoke rapidly with his 2 associates, occasionally pointing toward exhibits spread across the counsel table. Their confidence had not disappeared, but urgency had quietly replaced comfort. Judge Victoria Hayes returned to the bench precisely on schedule. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and silence settled once more beneath the high ceiling. "Counsel," Judge Hayes said calmly, "you may proceed." Richard Coleman stood first for redirect examination. He approached Dr. Michael Bennett with the practiced confidence of a seasoned trial attorney determined to restore certainty before the jury. "Doctor," he began, "despite the additional information discussed during cross-examination, do you still believe your methodology followed accepted professional standards?" "Yes," Dr. Bennett answered honestly. "My methodology remained professionally appropriate based upon the materials I received." Coleman nodded with visible relief. "And nothing asked during cross-examination suggests you acted improperly?" "Correct." Coleman smiled slightly before returning to counsel table. "No further questions." Judge Hayes turned toward Ethan. "Mr. Walker, any recross?" Ethan stood immediately. "Briefly, Your Honor." Judge Hayes inclined her head. "Proceed." Ethan walked toward the witness, carrying only 1 folded document. His expression remained respectful. "Dr. Bennett, I appreciate your patience." "Of course." Ethan unfolded the single sheet of paper. "One question. Yesterday you testified that your conclusions were reliable because the source materials supplied to you were complete. Do you remember saying that?" "Yes." Ethan handed the document to the bailiff, who delivered it first to the witness and then to the judge. "Doctor, this is the transmittal letter that accompanied the investigative file sent to your office." Dr. Bennett adjusted his glasses and began reading. Ethan waited without speaking. The courtroom became remarkably still. After several seconds, Ethan asked quietly, "Would you please read the second paragraph aloud?" Dr. Bennett cleared his throat. "The enclosed materials represent preliminary documentation. Additional photographs, environmental records, and supplemental measurements remain pending and will be forwarded upon completion." Ethan nodded politely. "Did you ever receive those supplemental materials?" Dr. Bennett slowly lowered the paper. "No." "Were you aware they existed?" Another pause. "No." Ethan looked toward the jury before returning his attention to the witness. "Had you received those additional materials before preparing your report, would you have reviewed them?" "Absolutely." "Would they have been important?" "Yes." "Potentially significant?" Dr. Bennett answered with complete sincerity. "Yes." Richard Coleman rose immediately. "Objection, Your Honor." Judge Hayes looked toward him. "Basis." Coleman hesitated for only a moment. "Asked and answered." Judge Hayes remained silent while reviewing the document herself. Finally, she looked back toward the courtroom. "Overruled." The document speaks for itself. Coleman slowly sat down without another word. Ethan asked one final question. "Doctor, as you sit here today, can you honestly tell this jury that your opinion was formed using every available piece of relevant evidence?" Dr. Bennett looked down at the transmittal letter once more before lifting his eyes toward the jury box. His voice remained steady, but the certainty had changed. "No, I cannot honestly say that." No one in the courtroom moved. The answer hung in the air with quiet weight. Ethan simply nodded. "Thank you, Doctor. I have no further questions." He returned to his seat without another glance toward the witness. Judge Hayes watched him for several long seconds before making a brief note in the margin of her file. For the first time since the trial began, she did not immediately call the next matter. Instead, she carefully reread the transmittal letter herself. Richard Coleman remained seated, staring at the same document that had quietly changed the direction of the morning. In the second row, Emma looked toward her father with the same calm confidence she always carried. Ethan smiled gently before opening his notebook once again. Hidden between two handwritten pages rested a small military photograph from many years earlier, showing a younger Ethan standing beside a courtroom inside an Army legal building while wearing a dress uniform instead of civilian clothes. He looked at the photograph for only a brief moment before sliding it back into the notebook. No one else noticed. Not yet. But somewhere inside the courtroom, as Judge Victoria Hayes quietly observed the remarkable discipline, precision, and restraint with which the single father had dismantled the strongest testimony presented against him, a question had begun forming in her mind. This was no ordinary self-represented litigant. There was a history behind his quiet confidence that had not yet been revealed, and she found herself unexpectedly waiting to discover what it was. Judge Victoria Hayes remained still for several quiet seconds after Dr. Michael Bennett stepped down from the witness stand. The courtroom no longer carried the subtle confidence that had favored one side throughout the opening days of trial. Instead, every person present seemed to recognize that something unexpected had begun unfolding, one careful question at a time. Ethan Walker quietly organized the few documents he had actually used during the examination and returned each page to its exact position inside the worn leather briefcase. Richard Coleman watched the movement without saying a word. It was difficult to ignore the discipline behind such simple habits. Every exhibit had appeared exactly when needed. Every question had led somewhere deliberate. Nothing had been wasted. Judge Hayes finally looked toward Ethan. "Mr. Walker, before we proceed to the next witness, I have a procedural question." Ethan immediately stood. "Yes, Your Honor. The organization of your examination was unusually precise for someone representing himself. Did another attorney assist you in preparing these materials?" Ethan answered calmly. "No, Your Honor." "No legal consultant?" "No, Your Honor." "No outside advisor?" "No, Your Honor." Judge Hayes studied him carefully before nodding. "Very well." She turned briefly toward the clerk before calling the next witness, a private investigator named Samuel Pierce, whose report had supplied much of the information relied upon by Dr. Bennett. Pierce approached the witness stand with measured confidence. Unlike the previous witness, he carried a thick folder beneath his arm and frequently glanced toward Richard Coleman before answering preliminary questions. Coleman guided him through the investigation, emphasizing careful interviews, detailed measurements, and extensive documentation. Everything appeared orderly on the surface. Ethan listened without interruption, occasionally writing only a single word before looking up again. Nearly an hour later, Judge Hayes turned toward the defense table. "Mr. Walker, your cross-examination." Ethan stood quietly and approached the witness. "Good afternoon, Mr. Pierce." "Good afternoon. You prepared the investigative summary introduced into evidence?" "Yes." "You supervised the evidence collection?" "Yes." "You selected which photographs would be included in the final report?" Pierce answered confidently. "Yes." Ethan nodded once. "Did you also decide which photographs would not be included?" The investigator hesitated only briefly. "Yes." Ethan opened a slim folder and removed 3 photographs placed inside transparent sleeves. "Your Honor, these images were produced during discovery, but were omitted from the final investigative report." Richard Coleman immediately stood. "Objection." Judge Hayes looked toward him. "On what grounds?" "Relevance." Ethan answered respectfully before the judge ruled. "Your Honor, these photographs were taken by the witness on the same date as the admitted exhibits. I intend only to establish why they were excluded." Judge Hayes reviewed the exhibit list for a moment. "Overruled. You may proceed." Ethan handed the photographs to the bailiff. Samuel Pierce studied them quietly before lowering his eyes. Ethan spoke gently. "Did you personally take these photographs?" "Yes." "Why were they excluded from your final report?" Pierce shifted slightly in the witness chair. "I believed other photographs showed the scene more clearly." "More clearly?" "Yes." Ethan picked up one of the enlarged displays already admitted into evidence. The photograph included in your report does not show the large oak tree discussed yesterday. Correct. Ethan lifted one of the omitted photographs. The same location appeared, but the oak tree occupied the center of the frame. This photograph does. Yes. Was the tree physically present on the day you conducted your investigation? Yes. Ethan paused. Did you remove this photograph because it complicated the visibility analysis? Richard Coleman stood once again. Objection. Argumentative. Judge Hayes considered the question carefully before speaking. Sustained. Please rephrase. Ethan nodded immediately. Certainly, Your Honor. He turned back toward Pierce. Did the presence of the tree affect what could be seen from the reported observation point? Pierce remained silent long enough for the courtroom to notice. Finally, he answered quietly. Yes. Ethan asked one final follow-up. Would the jury have benefited from seeing that photograph while evaluating line of sight? Another pause followed. Samuel Pierce looked briefly toward Richard Coleman before answering with visible reluctance. Yes. A faint breath seemed to pass through the gallery almost all at once. Judge Hayes leaned slightly forward. Richard Coleman no longer looked toward the jury. Ethan thanked the witness before returning to his table. As he opened his notebook to prepare for the next series of questions, a folded document slipped gently onto the defense table. Judge Hayes noticed the seal immediately before Ethan could pick it up. It was an official Department of the Army certificate bearing the insignia of the Judge Advocate General's Corps. Ethan calmly retrieved it without drawing attention, but the brief glimpse had already answered the question quietly forming in Judge Hayes's mind. She did not interrupt the proceedings. She did not ask about the document. She simply looked once more at the man standing alone before her and realized that his remarkable courtroom discipline had not appeared by accident. Somewhere in his past existed years of legal training that no one in the courtroom had bothered to ask about before deciding who he was. For the first time since the trial began, Judge Victoria Hayes found herself wondering not whether Ethan Walker understood the law, but how many people had underestimated him simply because he had never felt the need to announce what he already knew. The afternoon session resumed beneath a silence that felt heavier than anything the courtroom had experienced since the trial began. Samuel Pierce remained in the witness chair, but the confidence with which he had entered the room had quietly faded beneath the steady rhythm of Ethan Walker's questions. No one laughed anymore. No one whispered predictions about how quickly the case would end. Even the reporters had stopped trying to write every sentence because they had begun watching the faces inside the courtroom instead. Judge Victoria Hayes folded her hands carefully on the bench, her full attention resting on the witness stand. Richard Coleman remained seated, studying his notes with growing concern. Ethan approached the witness, once again carrying only a single folder. "Mr. Pierce," he began calmly, "I have just a few more questions." "All right. You testified that you personally selected the photographs included in your investigative summary." "Yes." "You also confirmed that several photographs showing the large oak tree were intentionally excluded." Pierce lowered his eyes briefly. "Yes." Ethan nodded politely. "Let us discuss your field notes." He removed a small spiral notebook already listed among the discovery exhibits and handed it to the bailiff. Pierce immediately recognized it. "Those are your original notes?" Ethan asked. "Yes." "Written at the scene?" "Yes." Ethan waited until the witness finished reviewing the notebook. "Would you please turn to page 14? The witness slowly complied. Near the bottom, would you read the final sentence aloud? Pierce hesitated before reading quietly. Visibility partially obstructed by mature oak tree from western observation point. Ethan allowed several seconds of silence to pass before asking his next question. Was the western observation point the same location from which your report concluded the primary witness observed the events? Yes. Did you include that handwritten observation in your final investigative summary? Pierce answered softly. No. Ethan did not raise his voice. Why not? Richard Coleman immediately stood. Objection, Your Honor. Judge Hayes looked toward him. State your grounds. The witness has already explained his editorial decisions. Judge Hayes remained thoughtful for a moment before answering. Overruled. The witness may answer. Pierce looked down at his notebook once again. I believe the obstruction was not significant enough to change my overall conclusions. Ethan nodded respectfully. That was your judgment? Yes. Was Dr. Bennett informed that your own handwritten field notes described an obstructed line of sight? Pierce slowly shook his head. No. Was the jury informed? No. Was anyone reviewing your final report informed? Another pause. No. The courtroom became completely still. Ethan closed the notebook gently before placing it back on the evidence table. He walked toward the digital display and projected two documents side by side. On the left appeared Pierce's polished investigative summary. On the right appeared the original handwritten field notes. The difference required no explanation. One document described a clear observation point. The other acknowledged a visual obstruction. Ethan turned toward the witness. Mr. Pierce, are both of these documents yours? Yes. Were both created during the same investigation? Yes. Which one was written first? The handwritten notes. Ethan looked briefly toward the jury. The notes made before any reports were prepared? Yes. Ethan asked one final question. Would you agree that observations recorded at the scene are generally less influenced by later assumptions than summaries written afterward? Pierce closed his eyes briefly before answering. Yes. Richard Coleman slowly lowered his head into his hands for only a second before sitting upright again. The answer had done more damage than any argument ever could. Ethan thanked the witness with complete sincerity. I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Pierce. I am under oath, Pierce replied quietly. As we all should remember, Ethan answered. Judge Hayes watched the brief exchange with thoughtful eyes. The respect Ethan consistently showed every witness had become impossible to ignore. He never attempted to embarrass anyone. He never celebrated difficult answers. He simply created enough space for the truth to emerge on its own. After the witness was excused, Judge Hayes requested that both admitted exhibits remain displayed for the jury. She studied the documents for several long moments before looking toward Ethan. Mr. Walker. Ethan immediately stood. Yes, Your Honor. Her voice sounded noticeably different from the opening day of trial. The impatience had disappeared completely. The court appreciates the professionalism with which you have conducted your examination. Ethan answered simply. Thank you, Your Honor. Richard Coleman looked across the courtroom at the man he had dismissed only yesterday. For the first time, he no longer saw an unrepresented father struggling to defend himself. He saw someone who understood evidence, preparation, and the quiet discipline of asking exactly the right question at exactly the right moment. In the second row, Emma smiled softly as she watched her father return to the defense table. She remembered countless evenings when he had quietly repeated the same words while helping her with homework. Never rush to answer, he would say. First, make sure you understand the question. Sitting inside the courtroom now, she realized those words had guided far more than homework. They had quietly guided every step her father had taken, and one careful question at a time. The strongest case built against him had begun to collapse beneath the simple weight of the truth. The courtroom remained unusually quiet as the final witness stepped down from the stand. No one rushed to speak. No one shuffled papers with the confidence that had filled the room only 2 days earlier. The evidence board that had once appeared so convincing now displayed unanswered questions beside every carefully prepared exhibit. Judge Victoria Hayes looked across the courtroom with thoughtful eyes before adjusting the file resting in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a different tone than it had during the opening session of the trial. Mr. Walker, she said calmly, before we proceed, the court has several questions regarding the documentary evidence you introduced. Ethan immediately rose. Yes, Your Honor. Please approach. He walked toward the bench with the same measured pace that had defined every step of the trial. Richard Coleman watched silently from counsel table. His legal team no longer whispered among themselves. They simply listened. Judge Hayes lifted the county survey, the weather records, the investigative notes, and the omitted photographs one by one. These materials were all produced during discovery? Yes, Your Honor. None were obtained after litigation began? No, Your Honor. And each was disclosed according to procedural rules? Yes, Your Honor. Judge Hayes nodded slowly before making another note. She looked toward Richard Coleman. Counsel, does the plaintiff dispute the authenticity of these exhibits? Coleman stood. For the first time since the trial had begun, his confidence appeared replaced by careful restraint. No, Your Honor. We do not dispute authenticity. Do you dispute that several of these documents were omitted from the investigative summary presented to Dr. Bennett? Coleman hesitated. No, Your Honor. The courtroom seemed to grow even quieter. Judge Hayes looked back toward Ethan. Mr. Walker, during your examination you never accused any witness of dishonesty. No, Your Honor. Instead, you questioned whether important information had been omitted. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Hayes rested both hands on the bench. That distinction matters. Ethan answered simply. Truth usually becomes clearer when people are allowed to explain rather than defend themselves. Several jurors looked up immediately after hearing those words. Even the court reporter paused for the briefest moment before continuing to type. Judge Hayes studied Ethan carefully. Earlier in these proceedings, this court expressed concern regarding your decision to represent yourself. Ethan remained respectfully silent. The judge continued. Based upon everything presented during the last 2 days, I believe it is appropriate to acknowledge that your preparation has been exceptionally thorough and consistently professional. Richard Coleman lowered his eyes toward the documents spread across his table. The compliment carried more weight than anyone expected because it came from the very person who had questioned Ethan's ability before the trial had truly begun. Ethan responded with quiet humility. Thank you, Your Honor. Judge Hayes looked directly at him. Mr. Walker, please continue. The courtroom almost seemed to stop breathing. The sentence was simple, yet everyone present recognized how different it sounded from the opening day. There was no impatience left, no assumption, only genuine judicial respect. Ethan nodded once. Thank you, Your Honor. He returned to the evidence table and opened the worn leather briefcase once more. Inside remained only a few unopened folders. He selected one carefully labeled in neat handwriting and carried it toward the lectern. Your Honor, he said, before resting my cross-examination, I request permission to introduce one final exhibit already listed in discovery. Judge Hayes glanced toward the exhibit log before nodding. Permission granted. Ethan handed the sealed folder to the bailiff. Inside rested a certified archival record from the county planning office together with an official chain of custody receipt documenting when the original investigative materials had first been submitted. Judge Hayes examined the certification seal carefully before passing copies to Richard Coleman. Coleman reviewed the pages silently. The color gradually faded from his expression. One of his associates leaned closer, reading the documents twice before whispering something almost inaudible. Coleman answered with only a slow nod. Ethan spoke quietly. Your Honor, these records establish the chronological order in which the investigative materials were created, revised, and distributed. Judge Hayes continued reading. I see that. Ethan added nothing further. He simply waited. After several long moments, the judge looked toward Richard Coleman. Counsel, does the plaintiff contest these certified public records? Coleman stood slowly. No, Your Honor. Do you request additional time to review them? Another pause. No, Your Honor. Judge Hayes returned her attention to Ethan. For the first time since the trial began, she no longer saw a father standing alone against experienced attorneys. She saw a disciplined advocate who had allowed evidence, patience, and respect to accomplish what emotion never could. In the second row, Emma watched quietly as her father closed the final folder and returned it to the briefcase with the same careful precision he had shown from the beginning. She smiled because she recognized the familiar routine from countless evenings at their dining room table. Finish one page. Put it back where it belongs. Stay calm. Tell the truth. Around the courtroom, no one laughed anymore. No one underestimated the quiet man standing alone. Instead, every eye remained fixed upon him, waiting to discover what final truth still rested inside the last unopened pages of his carefully prepared case. The late afternoon light filtered gently through the tall courtroom windows, softening the sharp lines of polished wood and brass railings that had witnessed decades of arguments, verdicts, and quiet moments of truth. Yet on this day, the silence felt unlike any other. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of people realizing they had judged a man before they understood him. Judge Victoria Hayes reviewed the certified records one final time before carefully closing the folder. She looked toward Richard Coleman. Counsel, does the plaintiff intend to present any additional evidence addressing the discrepancies established during cross-examination? Coleman slowly stood. The confidence that had once defined every movement had disappeared beneath professional honesty. No, Your Honor. Any additional witnesses? No, Your Honor. Judge Hayes nodded once before turning toward Ethan Walker. Mr. Walker, before the court proceeds further, do you wish to offer any additional evidence? Ethan stood calmly beside the defense table. Yes, Your Honor. One final document. He opened the worn leather briefcase that had remained beside him since the first morning of trial. Inside, only one sealed envelope remained. He removed it carefully, almost reverently, before handing it to the bailiff. The envelope carried the official seal of the United States Department of the Army. Judge Hayes accepted the document with visible curiosity. She examined the certification before quietly reading several pages. Her expression gradually changed from curiosity to unmistakable surprise. She looked back toward Ethan. This document certifies that you served in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. Yes, Your Honor. The courtroom became perfectly still. Judge Hayes continued reading. You completed military legal training. Yes, Your Honor. You served as a trial counsel? Yes, Your Honor. Another pause followed. You later instructed junior officers in courtroom procedure and evidence evaluation? Ethan answered with the same quiet humility that had marked every response throughout the trial. Yes, Your Honor. No one spoke. Richard Coleman looked toward Ethan with genuine astonishment. Several jurors exchanged brief glances before returning their attention to the bench. Even the reporters stopped writing for a moment, allowing the significance of the revelation to settle naturally. Judge Hayes looked down once more at the official record before asking softly, "Why did you never mention this when the court questioned your decision to represent yourself?" Ethan smiled gently. Because my military service does not make my evidence more truthful. The answer lingered throughout the courtroom. Judge Hayes remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. The court expressed concern that you lacked legal training. I understood that concern, Your Honor. You could have corrected that assumption immediately. Ethan nodded. I could have. Why did you choose not to? Ethan looked briefly toward Emma, sitting quietly in the second row before answering. Because I wanted this case to be decided by facts rather than credentials. If the evidence could not stand on its own, my resume would not have saved it. Emma smiled softly as tears quietly gathered in Margaret Collins's eyes beside her. The elderly neighbor remembered every evening Ethan had spent at the dining room table, studying after Emma had gone to bed, never once complaining about how difficult the case had become. He had never spoken about military honors. He had never mentioned legal experience. He had simply prepared. Judge Hayes slowly removed her reading glasses and placed them beside the file. Her voice carried unmistakable sincerity. Mr. Walker, this court owes you an acknowledgement. Ethan remained respectfully silent. Earlier in these proceedings, I assumed your lack of legal representation reflected a lack of legal understanding. That assumption was mine, not yours. Richard Coleman quietly lowered his eyes. The words carried weight not because they admitted error, but because they demonstrated the integrity expected from the bench. Ethan answered with quiet grace. We all make decisions based upon the information available at the time, Your Honor. Judge Hayes looked directly at him. That is true. It is also our responsibility to change those decisions when better information becomes available. Several jurors nodded almost instinctively. The lesson reached far beyond the legal dispute before them. Judge Hayes continued. The professionalism, restraint, and respect you have shown every witness have reflected the highest standards expected in any courtroom. Ethan inclined his head modestly. Thank you, Your Honor. She looked once more at the Army certification resting beside the evidence introduced throughout the trial. Your military record explains your discipline. Ethan smiled faintly. My daughter explains everything else. Every eye in the courtroom turned naturally toward Emma. She blushed slightly before smiling back at her father. Judge Hayes followed their quiet exchange with thoughtful eyes. For the first time since the proceedings had begun, she no longer saw only a veteran or a self-represented litigant. She saw a father whose greatest achievement had never appeared on an official document. It sat quietly in the second row wearing a blue dress, believing in him long before anyone else inside the courtroom chose to do the same. Outside, the afternoon sun slipped lower behind the courthouse windows, filling the room with warm golden light. Inside, titles, assumptions, and first impressions had quietly begun giving way to something stronger. Respect earned not by announcing who someone had once been, but by demonstrating who they chose to be every single day. The final afternoon session began beneath a calm silence that seemed to settle naturally across every corner of the courtroom. Sunlight stretched through the tall windows, casting long golden reflections across the polished wooden floor where so many hurried footsteps had echoed only days before. Now no one hurried. Every juror sat with careful attention. Every spectator waited quietly. Even the reporters rested their pens for a moment, sensing that the trial had reached the point where truth no longer needed dramatic arguments. Judge Victoria Hayes reviewed the complete record one final time before looking toward both tables. Her voice remained steady, measured, and unmistakably thoughtful. The court has carefully considered the testimony, the admitted exhibits, the certified public records, and the credibility of every witness. Richard Coleman stood respectfully, no longer carrying the confidence that had marked his opening statement. Ethan Walker remained standing beside the defense table with his worn leather briefcase closed at his side. Nothing about his posture suggested celebration. He simply waited. Judge Hayes continued. This court finds that multiple material facts presented during the plaintiff's case were incomplete. Several significant investigative observations were omitted from the final summary despite existing within the original field documentation. Expert conclusions were formed without access to complete supporting materials. Critical environmental conditions affecting witness perception were likewise absent from the reports upon which testimony relied. She paused briefly before continuing. The cumulative effect of those omissions substantially reduces the reliability of the evidence presented against Mr. Walker. A quiet breath passed through the courtroom. Judge Hayes turned another page before speaking again. Accordingly, the court finds that the plaintiff has failed to meet the required burden of proof. Silence followed. It was deeper than applause could ever have been. Richard Coleman slowly lowered his head before standing once more. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "on behalf of my client, I acknowledge the court's ruling." There was no argument left, no request to interrupt, only professional acceptance. Judge Hayes nodded respectfully. The court appreciates counsel's professionalism throughout these proceedings. She signed the final order with deliberate care before handing it to the clerk. The sound of the pen touching paper seemed almost symbolic. One careful signature completed what countless assumptions had nearly prevented. Judge Hayes looked directly toward Ethan. "Mr. Walker, judgment is entered in your favor." Ethan closed his eyes briefly before opening them once again. "Thank you, Your Honor." His voice carried gratitude rather than triumph. He did not raise his fists. He did not celebrate. He simply accepted the decision with the same dignity that had carried him through every difficult question. Emma quietly covered her mouth with both hands before smiling through tears of relief. Margaret Collins gently placed one comforting hand upon the little girl's shoulder. Around them, several spectators who had entered expecting to watch an inexperienced father lose his case now looked toward him with quiet admiration. Judge Hayes remained seated for another moment instead of immediately leaving the bench. "Before this matter concludes," she said, "the court wishes to make one additional observation." Every eye returned toward her. Justice depends upon evidence rather than assumptions. This case has served as an important reminder that appearances, resources, titles, and first impressions are poor substitutes for careful examination of the facts. She looked briefly toward Ethan. Mr. Walker consistently conducted himself with professionalism, courtesy, and respect toward every witness, even when challenging important testimony. The court recognizes that standard. Ethan answered simply, "Thank you, Your Honor." Judge Hayes added one final sentence. "May every future proceeding before this court reflect the same commitment to truth." The bailiff formally announced that court was adjourned, yet almost no one stood immediately. The moment seemed too meaningful to rush. Richard Coleman quietly approached Ethan before gathering his own files. He extended his hand across the aisle. Ethan accepted it without hesitation. "You prepared exceptionally well," Coleman admitted sincerely. Ethan smiled gently. "Thank you." Coleman nodded once. "I underestimated you." Ethan answered with quiet grace. "We all learn." No resentment remained between them, only mutual respect earned through honesty. As people gradually began leaving the courtroom, several jurors paused beside Ethan to thank him for the respectful manner in which he had presented every question. One elderly juror smiled warmly before saying, "You reminded all of us that listening carefully matters." Ethan simply nodded. Thank you for listening. Emma finally reached her father and wrapped her arms tightly around him. I knew you would tell the truth, she whispered. Ethan knelt beside her and smiled. You never stopped believing. Emma shook her head gently. Mom always said that character speaks before titles. Ethan looked toward the empty witness stand for a brief moment before answering softly. She was right. The courtroom gradually emptied until only warm afternoon sunlight remained across the polished wooden floor, quietly illuminating the bench, the witness chair, and the defense table where one ordinary father had stood alone against overwhelming expectations. Nothing about the room itself had changed, yet everyone who walked out of it carried something different than they had brought inside. They entered believing confidence always sounded loud. They departed understanding that truth often arrived with a quiet voice, patient questions, steady hands, and the kind of dignity that never needed to announce itself to be believed. The courthouse had grown quiet by the time the last visitors stepped through its heavy wooden doors and into the cool evening air. Golden light settled across the stone steps as the courthouse clock marked the end of a day that would be remembered for far more than a single ruling. Ethan Walker carried the same worn leather briefcase that had accompanied him from the first morning of trial. It felt no lighter than before because its true weight had never come from the documents inside. It had carried responsibility, patience, and hope. Beside him, Emma slipped her small hand into his without saying a word. They stood together for a moment beneath the broad columns overlooking the town square where people hurried home after work, completely unaware that inside those courtroom walls, several lives had quietly changed. Behind them, the courthouse doors opened once more. Judge Victoria Hay stepped outside, no longer shielded by the height of the bench or the formality of the courtroom. She paused for a moment before walking toward Ethan with measured steps. He noticed her approach and turned respectfully. Emma looked up at her father before taking a small step back, sensing that this conversation belonged to the adults. Judge Hayes stopped a comfortable distance away. For the first time since they had met, there was no courtroom between them, no witnesses, no jury, and no official record. Only two people standing beneath the evening sky. Mr. Walker, she began quietly, may I have a moment? Ethan nodded. Of course, Your Honor. She smiled gently. Right now, Victoria will do. Ethan returned the smile with quiet respect. Certainly. She looked toward the courthouse before speaking again. I have spent many years reminding juries not to judge too quickly. Today I realized that judges must remember the same lesson. Ethan remained silent, allowing her words the space they deserved. When I first saw you standing alone without legal counsel, she continued, I believed I understood your situation. I believed experience had allowed me to recognize it immediately. I was wrong. Ethan answered softly. You corrected that conclusion when new facts appeared. That is exactly what justice requires. Victoria lowered her eyes for a brief moment before looking back at him. Thank you for showing this court what professionalism looks like even when respect is not offered first. Ethan shook his head gently. Respect is easiest to give when someone else has already earned it. The real test is giving it before that happens. The words settled quietly between them. Victoria smiled, understanding that the lesson extended far beyond a courtroom. Your daughter is fortunate to have you, she said. Ethan glanced toward Emma, who stood nearby watching birds gather in the branches of a large oak tree across the street. I think I am the fortunate one. Emma looked back toward them and smiled. She walked over, slipping her hand into her father's once again. Victoria knelt slightly so she could speak to the little girl at eye level. Your father made many people proud today. Emma smiled with simple certainty. He makes me proud every day. Victoria felt her own smile deepen. That may be the greatest compliment anyone receives. Emma nodded. My mom always said that good people do not have to tell everyone they are good. Other people figure it out eventually. Ethan looked quietly toward the evening sky. Sarah's words had found their way into another heart, and somehow that felt like another kind of victory. Victoria stood once more. I hope you continue practicing law. Ethan smiled softly. I think I already have the most important job I will ever hold. He looked down at Emma. Being her father, Victoria followed his gaze before extending her hand. Ethan accepted it warmly. There was no tension left between them. Only mutual respect built not through perfect first impressions, but through the willingness to learn from them. As they parted, The courthouse lights slowly illuminated against the deepening blue of the evening. Ethan and Emma walked toward the old pickup truck parked along the curb. Before climbing inside, Emma looked back one last time at the courthouse, standing quietly against the fading sky. Dad, yes. Were you ever angry? Ethan thought carefully before answering. For a little while. What changed? He opened the passenger door for her before replying. I remembered that proving someone wrong is never as important as helping them discover the truth. Emma smiled thoughtfully before climbing inside. During the drive home, neither of them spoke very much. They did not need to. The familiar roads, the quiet neighborhoods, and the warm lights glowing through family windows somehow felt different now. Not because the world had changed, but because they had walked through it with dignity instead of bitterness. Back at their small home, Ethan placed the worn leather briefcase on the dining room table where he had spent so many evenings preparing page after page while Emma completed her homework nearby. He opened it one final time, removed the neatly organized binders, and placed them gently into a cabinet. Then he closed the empty briefcase and rested his hand upon it for just a moment before turning off the light. Some victories ended with applause. Others ended with silence. The quiet kind lasted longer. And somewhere beyond titles, uniforms, verdicts, and assumptions, the greatest lesson remained beautifully simple. Character is never proven by speaking louder than everyone else. It is revealed by choosing truth over pride, grace over resentment, and quiet dignity even when no one believes you deserve to be heard. In the end, the courtroom remembered the ruling, but the people who were there remembered something even greater. They remembered the ordinary single father who never demanded respect, yet quietly earned it from everyone who had once underestimated him.